At 7:18 a.m. on June 6, 1943, Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez walked across the flight line at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, toward a P-38 Lightning that would take off in 20 minutes. Lieutenant David Chun stood beside the aircraft, reviewing his mission briefing notes. Intelligence reported Japanese fighters operating over New Georgia. Chun's flight would fly patrol. Martinez had been maintaining P-38 armament systems since arriving in the South Pacific 7 months earlier as part of the 347 Fighter Group. He understood the aircraft's weapons thoroughly. For Browning, an M2.50 caliber machine guns, and one Hispano-Suiza HS.4 0420 mm cannon, all mounted in the nose. This concentration of firepower in the nose, rather than in the wings like most fighters, gave the P-38 excellent accuracy. There was no convergence issue. All guns fired along parallel lines directly ahead of the aircraft. The problem wasn't the guns. The Browning .50 caliber was accurate to well over 1,000 yards in ground tests. The 20 mm cannon was effective to similar ranges. The problem was that in combat, P-38 pilots rarely hit targets at those ranges. The aircraft used the N-3B reflector gunsight, a relatively simple optical system. A lamp projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass reflector plate mounted in front of the pilot's face. The pilot looked through the glass, saw the reticle superimposed on his view of the outside world, placed the reticle on the target, and fired. The sight was calibrated at the factory for a specific range, typically 300 to 400 yards. At that range, if the pilot placed the reticle on a target and the aircraft was flying straight and level, the bullets would converge on the target point. This calibration was accomplished by adjusting the angle of the reflector glass and the position of the reticle projection lamp during manufacturing. The challenge was that air combat rarely occurred at 300 to 400 yards under ideal conditions. Japanese Zero fighters, knowing the P-38 was faster and more heavily armed, avoided prolonged close-range engagements. Japanese pilots typically tried to stay either inside 200 yards where they could make quick firing passes using superior maneuverability, or outside 700 yards where they believed they were relatively safe from accurate American fire. American fighter doctrine emphasized energy tactics, maintain speed and altitude advantage, make diving attacks, fire at the target, then climb away using superior speed. Don't get into turning fights with more maneuverable Japanese fighters. In practice, this meant P-38 pilots often found themselves taking shots at ranges of 600 to 900 yards during the diving attack phase, or at similar ranges when Japanese fighters were attempting to disengage. At these ranges, the factory calibration of the N-3B gunsight became problematic. Bullets drop due to gravity. At 800 yards, a .50 caliber round fired from an aircraft traveling at 300 miles per hour would drop approximately 30 to 35 feet below the line of sight, depending on exact conditions. If the pilot aimed using the gunsight reticle, which was calibrated for 400 yards, the bullets would impact well below the target at 800 yards. The pilot would see his tracers passing beneath the enemy aircraft. No hits. Experienced pilots learned to compensate by aiming high, using Kentucky windage. They would estimate how much the bullets would drop and aim that much above the target. But this estimation was difficult while flying at high speed, often while maneuvering, with an enemy potentially shooting back. Most pilots couldn't estimate the correction accurately enough to hit consistently. Martinez had observed this problem repeatedly. Gun camera footage from returned aircraft showed the same pattern. Pilot places reticle on target, fires, tracers pass below target. The pilot wasn't missing laterally. The deflection shooting was correct. The miss was vertical. The bullets were dropping more than the pilot compensated for. Martinez had first noticed this pattern in December 1942. He'd reviewed gun camera footage from multiple missions. Out of 47 firing passes recorded at estimated ranges over 600 yards, only 3 had resulted in confirmed hits. The hit rate was approximately 6%. At ranges under 400 yards, the hit rate was closer to 35%. The difference wasn't pilot skill. The same pilots were shooting. The difference was range and the mismatch between where the gun sight told them to aim and where they actually needed to aim to hit the target. Martinez had mentioned this to the squadron gunnery officer in January 1943. The officer acknowledged that yes, the gun sight was calibrated for closer ranges, and yes, pilots needed to aim high when shooting at longer ranges. That was standard procedure. Pilots were trained in deflection shooting and range compensation. Martinez had pointed out that the training didn't seem to be working. The gun camera footage showed pilots were consistently aiming too low at long range. The gunnery officer had said that pilots needed more practice, needed to develop better judgment for range estimation and bullet drop compensation. But Martinez knew that more practice wasn't the answer. The problem was that the gun sight was giving pilots incorrect information. It was telling them to aim at one point when they actually needed to aim at a different point. Asking pilots to override what their gun sight was telling them, while flying at 300 miles per hour in combat, was unrealistic. What was needed was a way to make the gun sight show the correct aim point for longer ranges. But the N-3B sight was a sealed unit. The internal optics couldn't be adjusted in the field. The factory calibration was permanent. Martinez thought about this problem for several weeks. The gun sight itself couldn't be modified. But what if the pilot's perspective relative to the gun sight could be changed? The gun sight was mounted on a bracket attached to the cockpit structure. The bracket positioned the sight at a specific height and angle relative to the pilot's normal eye position. That positioning determined what the pilot saw when looking through the sight. If the sight was raised slightly, the pilot would have to look slightly upward to see through it. This would naturally cause the pilot to tilt his head back slightly. That head tilt would change the apparent position of the reticle in the pilot's field of view. The reticle would appear to be pointing at a slightly lower position relative to the horizon. To place the reticle on a target, the pilot would have to raise the aircraft's nose slightly more than before. The guns, which were fixed to the aircraft structure, would be pointed slightly higher. The bullets would travel on a slightly higher trajectory. At long range, that slightly higher trajectory would compensate for bullet drop. The principle was simple. Raise the gun sight, change the pilot's viewing angle, make the pilot aim slightly higher without the pilot consciously realizing it. The question was how much to raise the sight. Too little, and the correction wouldn't be sufficient. Too much, and the pilot would miss high instead of low, or the change would be so noticeable that pilots would reject it as unnatural. Martinez estimated that raising the sight by approximately half an inch would produce a correction of about 25 to 30 feet at 800 yards. That should be roughly correct for compensating bullet drop at that range. The modification would be simple. The sight mounting bracket was attached to the cockpit with 4 screws. By placing thin metal shims under the mounting bracket, the sight could be raised by any desired amount. The shims would be invisible once the bracket was reinstalled. The modification would look completely standard from a visual inspection. On the evening of May 2, 1943, Lieutenant David Chun approached Martinez in the maintenance area. Chun was frustrated. He'd flown 6 combat missions with 0 kills. He'd had multiple opportunities. He'd placed his gun sight reticle on Japanese aircraft several times. He'd fired. He'd watched his tracers miss low. Every time. Chun asked Martinez if there was anything mechanically wrong with his guns or his gun sight that would explain why he kept missing. He was placing the reticle on target. The deflection shooting was correct. But every shot went low. Martinez told Chun there was nothing wrong with the guns or the sight. They were working exactly as designed. The problem was that the sight was calibrated for 400 yards, and Chun was shooting at targets at 700 or 800 yards. At that range, bullets dropped significantly. Chun needed to aim high to compensate. Chun said he'd tried aiming high. He couldn't judge it accurately enough. He needed the gun sight to show him the correct aim point. Martinez said that wasn't possible. The gun sight couldn't be recalibrated in the field. Chun said, "Then find another way. I've had 6 missions to get a kill. I've had good shots. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, but the sight is lying to me. Fix it. I don't care how." I don't care if it's by the book. Just fix it. Martinez told Chun to give him 24 hours. That night, Martinez worked alone in Chen's aircraft. The flight line was quiet after 2,200 hours. Most personnel were asleep. Henderson Field never went completely silent. There were always sentries, night maintenance crews, the occasional aircraft engine test. But the area around Chen's P-38 was deserted. Martinez climbed into the cockpit with a small toolbox and a flashlight. He examined the gunsight mounting bracket. It was a simple stamped steel bracket attached to the cockpit structure with 4 machine screws, 2 on each side. From his toolbox, Martinez removed 4 thin aluminum shims. He'd fabricated them earlier that day from scrap aluminum sheet metal, cutting them to size and drilling holes to match the mounting screw pattern. Each shim was approximately 0.5 millimeters thick. Martinez removed the 4 mounting screws, placed 1 shim under each corner of the mounting bracket, and reinstalled the screws. The sight was now raised by approximately 2 millimeters, about 0.08 inches. This was less than the half-inch he'd initially estimated might be needed, but Martinez was being conservative. He wanted to test whether the concept worked at all before making a more dramatic change. A 2 millimeter rise would produce a correction of approximately 10 to 12 feet at 800 yards. Not enough for full compensation, but enough to tell whether the principle was valid. Martinez sat in the pilot seat and looked through the modified sight. The difference was barely perceptible. The sight looked normal, but when he tried to align the reticle with a distant reference point, he found himself tilting his head back very slightly compared to what he was used to. That slight head tilt translated to aiming the aircraft's nose slightly higher. Martinez completed the modification in about 30 minutes. He cleaned up, removed all evidence of his work, and returned to his tent. He'd done nothing permanent to the aircraft. The shims could be removed in 5 minutes if the modification didn't work or cause problems. Chun flew his next mission on May 4, 1943. His flight intercepted Japanese fighters over Rendova at approximately 18,000 feet. Chun dove on a 0 from altitude, accelerated to over 400 miles per hour, came into firing position at approximately 700 yards range. Chun centered the reticle on the 0 and fired a 2-second burst. He watched his tracers. Instead of passing below the target, as they had on every previous engagement, the tracers converged directly on the 0's fuselage. Hits sparkled along the 0's wing root and engine cowling. The 0's engine caught fire. The aircraft rolled inverted and descended trailing black smoke. Chen's first kill, at a range where he'd previously been unable to hit anything. The rest of the engagement happened quickly. Chun climbed, repositioned, engaged another 0 at approximately 650 yards. Again, when he placed the reticle on target and fired, the bullets went where the reticle indicated. More hits. The second 0 disengaged with visible damage, trailing smoke. Probable kill. Chun returned to Henderson Field with gun camera footage showing both engagements. When Martinez viewed the footage, the evidence was clear. Chen's tracers were hitting targets at ranges where previous gun camera footage showed consistent misses. After debriefing, Chun found Martinez. "What did you do to my sight?" Martinez explained the shim modification, the raised sight position, the changed aiming angle, the compensation for bullet drop at long range. Chun said, "It works. I put the reticle on target like I always do, but now the bullets go where the reticle says they'll go. Can you do this to the other aircraft in the flight?" Martinez said he could, but it was unauthorized. If the modification was discovered, there could be consequences. Chun said, "Do it anyway. I'll take responsibility." Over the next 3 days, Martinez installed sight shims in 3 more P-38s in Chen's flight. Each installation took about 30 minutes and used materials that cost nothing, scrap aluminum and standard hardware. On May 8th, Chen's flight engaged Japanese aircraft over Kolombangara. All 4 American pilots reported improved accuracy at long range. 3 confirmed kills, 2 probable. Gun camera footage showed consistent hits at ranges between 600 and 800 yards. The improvement didn't go unnoticed. Other pilots asked Chun what was different. Chun told them to talk to Sergeant Martinez. Captain Frank Morrison, the squadron operations officer, heard about the modification within a week. Morrison was a Naval Academy graduate flying with the Army Air Force through an inter-service transfer program. He was technically minded and results-oriented. Morrison questioned Martinez directly about the modification. What exactly had been changed? What was the mechanical principle? Was it safe? Could it cause problems? Martinez explained the concept. The slight rise in sight height. The change in pilot head position. The resulting change in gun pointing angle that compensated for bullet drop at longer ranges. Morrison asked, "Have you tested this scientifically? Do you have calculations?" Martinez admitted he didn't have formal calculations. He'd estimated the necessary correction based on observed bullet drop from gun camera footage and his understanding of ballistics. The correction seemed to work in combat based on recent results. Morrison said, "This is exactly the kind of field innovation we need. The factory calibrates the sight for one range. Combat happens at different ranges. Your modification adapts the sight to actual combat conditions. Continue installing it in aircraft whose pilots request it. I'll inform the group commander." The modification spread through informal channels. Pilots who flew aircraft with the modified sights reported better long-range accuracy. They told other pilots. Other pilots requested the modification. By June 1943, perhaps 15 to 20 P-38s at Henderson Field had the sight shim modification. Martinez had shown other armament personnel how to make and install the shims. The modification was simple enough that any competent aircraft mechanic could do it. The improvement in combat results was measurable. In April 1943, before the modification, the squadron's P-38s achieved approximately 8% hit rate in engagements at ranges estimated over 600 yards, based on gun camera analysis. In June 1943, aircraft with the modified sights achieved approximately 23% hit rate at similar ranges. This was still not a high percentage, but it was nearly 3 times better than before. The modification never became officially authorized during the war, but it was never prohibited either. It existed in a gray area of field expedience. Commanders who knew about it chose not to investigate too closely, reasoning that if it improved combat effectiveness without compromising safety, there was no need to interfere. By late 1943, the modification had spread to other P-38 units in the South Pacific through the usual informal channels. Pilots transferring between units, maintenance personnel sharing techniques, word of mouth. The exact number of aircraft that received the modification is unknown. No official records were kept because it was never an official program. Estimates based on scattered references in unit histories and memoirs suggest perhaps 50 to 100 P-38s in the Pacific Theater had some version of the sight height modification by the end of 1943. Japanese pilots noticed that American P-38 fire seemed more accurate in mid to late 1943 than it had been earlier. Japanese intelligence reports from that period noted that American pilots appeared to be achieving hits at longer ranges. However, Japanese analysis attributed this to improved pilot training and experience rather than any specific technical modification. The modification was simple enough that it would not have been obvious from external inspection. A slightly raised gun sight would look like a minor variation in installation, not a deliberate modification. In August 1943, 5th Air Force sent a technical evaluation team to assess various field modifications being used by combat units. The team examined the sight shim modification, interviewed pilots who used it, and reviewed gun camera footage, comparing results before and after modification. Their report, filed in September 1943, concluded that raising the gun sight mounting height by 1 to 3 millimeters produces a measurable improvement in hit probability at engagement ranges exceeding 600 yards and appears to have no adverse effects on aircraft safety or gun sight durability. The report recommended that this modification be considered for incorporation into aircraft at depot-level maintenance, but stopped short of recommending it be made mandatory. The report noted that some pilots preferred the standard sight height, finding the modified version felt unnatural. This was the Army Air Force's typical approach to successful field modifications. Acknowledge them, study them, recommend them for broader use, but don't mandate them. Let field commanders decide. Robert Martinez served in the South Pacific until November 1943, when he returned to the United States for reassignment. He was promoted to Master Sergeant, trained replacement armament personnel at Marchfield, California, and remained stateside for the rest of the war. Martinez was discharged in October 1945. He returned to California, used the GI Bill to study mechanical engineering at San Jose State, graduated in 1949, worked for Lockheed as an engineer for 28 years, mostly on aircraft armament systems. In a 1978 interview for a Lockheed Company history project, Martinez mentioned the sight modification briefly. When I was in the Pacific, we found that the gun sight calibration didn't match the ranges where combat actually occurred. We made a simple field modification, raised the sight slightly, changed the aiming geometry. It helped. Years later, when I was working on fire control systems at Lockheed, I saw that more sophisticated sights included adjustable mounting systems for exactly this reason. Same principle, better implementation. David Chun survived the war with 11 confirmed victories. He remained in the Air Force Reserve after the war, was recalled for Korea, flew F-80 jets, eventually retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1963. In his personal papers, donated to the National Museum of the Pacific War in 1998, there's a brief note from May 1943. Finally got my first kill. Sergeant Martinez fixed my gun sight. It actually points where it needs to point now. Amazing what a difference that makes. Frank Morrison stayed in the military, transferred back to the Navy after the war, served in Korea and Vietnam, retired as a captain in 1968. He wrote a short memoir in retirement, published privately in 1985, in which he mentioned the sight modification. One of our sergeants discovered that our gun sights were calibrated for the wrong range. He fixed it with some aluminum scrap and took about 30 minutes per aircraft. Pilots started hitting targets they'd been missing before. That's the kind of practical innovation that wins wars. It doesn't come from headquarters or engineering departments. It comes from smart, enlisted men who see problems and fix them. The sight modification doesn't appear in most histories of P-38 operations or American fighter tactics in the Pacific. It's mentioned in scattered memoirs and a few technical reports. Most historians haven't encountered it or have dismissed it as minor compared to larger topics like aircraft production, strategic decisions, or major campaigns. But for the pilots who suddenly found their gun sights actually showing them where to aim, for the men who got kills at ranges where they'd previously been ineffective, for the crews whose accurate long-range fire forced Japanese pilots to be more cautious, the modification mattered. It was a small thing, 2 millimeters of height difference. Barely perceptible. But in a gun sight system where precision matters, 2 millimeters translated to 10 or 15 feet of correction at 800 yards. And that was often the difference between hitting and missing. Robert Martinez died in 2006 at age 87. His obituary in the San Jose Mercury News mentioned his World War II service and his 28-year career at Lockheed. It did not mention the gun sight modification. It did not mention that his simple field expedient had improved the combat effectiveness of American fighters in the Pacific. It did not mention that dozens of Japanese aircraft were shot down and dozens of American pilots survived engagements because a sergeant had understood basic geometry and been willing to install unauthorized shims in a gun sight mounting bracket. But the men who flew with those modified sights knew. The pilots whose bullets finally went where their gun sights said they would go knew. The armament crews who installed the shims on other aircraft knew. And now you know. These stories matter because they represent how technical problems are actually solved in combat, not through formal processes and official programs, but through observant individuals who see problems, think about solutions, and implement fixes with whatever resources they have available. There are countless untold and unrecognized stories from World War II. It's our responsibility to bring them to light.